In this video, we're going to write a test to make sure that when we deploy our inbox contract, we get some initial value for our message passed in. This is definitely going to be our first very real test. I know this has been a tremendous amount of buildup, but again, we're covering a lot of different topics here at the same time. We're talking about contracts and Web3 and the test network and Mocha. So even if it feels like we're going slow, honestly, it's probably for the best. Now, inside of our describe block right here for inbox, we're going to add another test. To add another test, we're going to add an it statement. For this message, I want to make sure that when we create a new contract, we get a default message. So I think I'm going to give this a description of it has a default message, like so. Now inside of here, we're going to need to write some code to somehow look at the inbox and somehow pull off this message property right here. That's definitely an interesting one. You'll recall that when we made use of Remix back over here, we could get access to the message property just by clicking this button. So when we clicked on message right here, we were calling a method or invoking a method on the contract to get access to the message instance variable. You'll also recall that because we specified this message variable was public, we automatically got that method generated for us. Now there's one thing I want to remind you about that's really important here. We had looked at this diagram previously. Now we looked at this many videos ago, so let me give you a quick reminder. Remember that there are two ways in which we can invoke a contract function. On the one hand side, we can call a function, and we call a function anytime we want to simply read data out of a contract. When we call a function, we instantly get back some amount of data, or at least relatively instantly. When we call a function with Web3, it's still an asynchronous request, but we don't have to wait for any transaction to be confirmed by a network or anything like that. So when I say runs instantly, well, it's relatively instantly. On the other hand, we had spoken about how we can modify a contract's data when we send a transaction to a function. So when we're thinking about the current case we are in right now, when we're thinking about somehow retrieving the message that gets set by default when we create this contract right here, I think that we want to call a method on our contract. We want to call a method because we want to retrieve a value off of our contract, and we don't want to modify any data that is tied to it. So inside of our test right here, we're going to write some code that is going to attempt to call a method on our inbox contract. Now the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to mark this function as being async. Remember what we just said a moment ago. Calling a method is like relatively instantaneous. It's still asynchronous, so we still have to assume that the calling the method is going to return a promise, and we still have to wait for that promise to be resolved. So we're going to use the async await syntax to wait for this message property to come back to us. Now I'm going to say const message. So we're going to assign the initial message to this variable right here. And then we'll say await inbox dot methods dot message dot call. All right, so let's look at this line carefully because this is a little snippet of code right here that we're going to be writing many times throughout this course. First off, we reference the contract. I think that's clear enough. This is an instance of the contract. It's a JavaScript object that represents the contract that exists on the blockchain. Our contract has a property called methods. Methods is an object that contains all of the different public functions that exist in our contract. So if we go back over to the source code over here, we would have two methods defined on our contract. We would have setMessage and message. Those are the two methods that are tied to our contract right now. So you can see that we are referencing the message property right here. If we wanted to somehow call, say, setMessage instead, then rather than calling methods.message, this would be setMessage. But of course we want the message here, so we're going to call this. Notice that when we call the method, we have, or when we reference this method, I should say, we immediately set one pair of parentheses right here. So when we call message, or when we're trying to call this method on the contract, we're going to have two sets of parentheses. The first one that is tied to the actual method, and then we have a second set of parentheses that's attached to the dot call that comes off of that. The way to remember this, or the way to understand what these two sets of parentheses are doing right here, is that the first set, we're going to pass in any arguments that this function might require. When we call the message, or when we try to retrieve the message property off of our contract, that doesn't require any arguments to be passed to it. However, if you look over at setMessage right here, this one does require an argument. So if we are trying to call a function that requires some arguments, we would pass those arguments into this first set of parentheses. The second set of parentheses are used to customize the transaction that we are attempting to send out to the network. So if this was not a call that we are doing to a function here, if this was actually us attempting to send a transaction, we might pass in an object that specifies exactly who is going to pay for this transaction and how much gas to use. And remember, when I say send, I'm talking about whenever we want to modify a contract's data. So again, we can think of the first set of parentheses as being some way to customize the list of arguments that's being passed to the function, and the second set is going to customize exactly how that function gets called. Now we're going to come back to this topic of discussing these two sets of parentheses many times, so I'll give you many reminders of when we're going to use one set versus the other. We'll see a lot of examples of it as we work with more code. So this is going to retrieve our message, and then the last thing we want to do here is to assert the value of the message. When we first initialized our contract up here, we gave it an initial message of the string hi there. So when we get this message back, well, it should definitely be the string hi there. So I'm going to say assert.equal message and hi there. To make our test a little bit more robust, we might decide to assign the string hi there to a variable up here at the top, maybe something like initial string equals hi there. And then we could reference this variable for arguments down here and for when we do the assertion down here. And that would just make sure that if someone ever comes along and modifies our test and decides, well, you know, hi there is a boring message, I want to do like bye there instead. If someone just changed this argument up here, then it would instantly cause our test to break. And an easy way to get around that is to instead reference one common variable. Now I'm not going to do that here for no good reason, but certainly if you want to, you could use that common variable in each location. All right, so let's save this and run our test at the command line and see how we're doing. So I'll run npm run test. And again, we have to wait a couple seconds. This delay is coming from the compilation process. Now we could decide to, say, compile our contract to a single file and not have to recompile every time we run our test, but honestly, that's just a little bit more effort. So I think we've got an easier to use solution right now. Okay, so here's our test. It looks like it's passing. So that means that any time that we deploy an instance of our contract, we are definitely getting some default message set on this instance. So this looks good. Let's continue in the next video, and we're going to write one more test to make sure that we are now able to update this message over time and then retrieve it again off the instance. So quick break, and we'll take care of that last test in the next video.